So the way the webinar will work today is our speakers have been invited to talk for 10 to 15 minutes. I think they're both on the chunkier side, which is very good. This is exactly what we want. After listening to all three speakers, we can have a little panel conversation between them with some questions that hopefully I will come up with as they're speaking. And then not too long after that, we'll come into a general group discussion. And as I said, if you have questions, you can use the little hand emoji on Zoom under the reactions, and you click reactions and you can raise your hand. That's probably going to be the easiest way that we do it, because people with their hands up on the screen, it doesn't always work and your arm gets tired, and we're at home and we don't want to exercise. So if we can use the buttons, that's ideal. Or if you just write it in the chat, that would also work. Good. So let's get started. So I think we agreed our first speaker is going to be Sister Dr. Gemma Simmonds. Yep. Excellent. So Gemma is a sister of the Congregation of Jesus and a senior research fellow at the Margaret Beaufort Institute of Theology in Cambridge, where she teaches pastoral theology and Christian spirituality. She has worked as a spiritual director and a retreat giver, training candidates for religious life and ordination in the Catholic and Anglican churches. Gemma has been a missionary in Brazil, a chaplain in the universities of Cambridge and London, and a volunteer chaplain in Holloway Prison. She's a regular religious broadcast on the BBC radio and has published extensively in the areas of spirituality, religious life, and ecclesiology. So there's quite a wealth of experience and wisdom I'm sure we'll receive this evening. Thank you ever so much, Gemma.
Sorry, the usual cry goes up. You're muted. Right. Thank you, dear friends, for the invitation. And it's lovely to be looking at your faces, some of you familiar and some of you not. Just to give you a little bit of background, apart from all that blurb on me, from the ecumenical point of view, I'm the daughter of a Welsh nonconformist. So, Gethin, it's great to see you there as a Welshman. And a French Catholic. So it doesn't get much more ecumenical than that, except that in the middle of all of that, I am an honorary canon of the church in Wales. So I feel as if I kind of span the entire spectrum, really. But I am one of the people on this screen who is old enough to remember, you know, the days when we entered into one another's churches, if at all, or got near one another's churches with great trepidation. One of my father's school friends, my father would have been 113 yesterday, so that just gives you a bit of an idea of where the age is coming from. He told me that as a schoolboy in the 1920s, his mother in South Wales had said to him, he used to go and stand at the bus stop waiting for the bus to take him home, and opposite the bus stop was the Catholic Church. "Don't go in there, boy. There's a scarlet woman in there." And of course, he was absolutely fascinated. And I used to stand there waiting for the scarlet woman to come out. And I was so disappointed she never came. He knew I was a Catholic telling me this story, and we used to laugh a great deal about this little Welsh nonconformist boy eagerly awaiting the exit of the scarlet woman from the Catholic Church. But I do actually remember that this is where we were. I also remember my first formal venture into ecumenical prayer, which must have been around 1968, where we were taken in the week of Prayer for Christian Unity as a class from my convent boarding school to the local Anglican church where there was a service going on. And I remember the whisper going all the way down the line to the sister at the end of the bench. They want us to pray to the Our Father together. Are we allowed? Is it all right? This horror that perhaps by praying the Our Father with people who were not Catholic like ourselves, we would in some way be damned forevermore, or most certainly would bring upon ourselves the wrath of God. And anyway, they had that funny bit at the end that we weren't quite sure about. What would we do when we got to saying that? Luckily for us, the sister at the other end sent the message back, "Of course we do. What do you think we've come for?" Of course we pray together. But I remember those moments historically because although to at least some of the people on the screen, the 1960s probably seem as far away to you as the 1860s seem to me, nevertheless, it's actually not that long ago that genuine church people were kind of warning their children against going anywhere near one another's places of worship, still less actually worshipping together. And we know, I don't need to tell you, that the contemporary ecumenical movement is dated more or less from 1910. I suppose as a Catholic here, what I would want to focus on most, having given you those little snapshots of where just very ordinary believers on the ground were coming from ecumenically, the extraordinary story of the Second Vatican Council, where not only were people who were Christians but not Roman Catholics were invited to come as observers. And although they didn't actually have the floor and they didn't intervene in the actual deliberations of the council, it has to be said that nor did any lay Catholics, because it was bishops only had the voice. Nevertheless, any history of the Second Vatican Council will tell you that the real moving and shaking, the real, as it were, theological horse trading was done on the whole in the cafes and in the restaurants and places where people had meals and coffee breaks afterwards. And it's perhaps because of this and because of the extraordinary openness that prevailed during the council, at least among some of the great theologians, both Reformed and Catholic, that in the great documents on the church, the great constitutions on the church, particularly the most important one and the most theological of them, Lumen Gentium, Catholics were invited, first of all, to believe in the universal call to holiness, that holiness was not, as had very much previously been assumed, to be the kind of private preserve, mostly of the clergy, and if not the clergy, the members of religious orders, but that all the baptized not only are called to holiness, but actually manifest signs of holiness. And also, it was very much enjoined on Catholics to understand baptism as a share in the threefold gifts of Christ and ministries of Christ as prophet, priest, and king. This, of course, feels completely normal to us now. Why would I even think of mentioning it? Well, I think of mentioning it because actually the origins of that theological definition are from that famous and well-known Roman Catholic, John Calvin. So here you have a Calvinist definition, or at least a Calvinist understanding of the origin and purpose and effect of baptism, smack in the middle of the most important and theologically important and authoritative document in the Catholic Church for hundreds of years. And in the same way, it talked very overtly and very carefully and clearly about the fact that all the baptized are called to share in the priesthood of all believers. Well, you know, Lutheran alert going on here. So here we have, in the most important Catholic document on the church, two doctrines over which Catholics and Reformed Christians had been fighting for hundreds of years, and all of a sudden here it is completely integrated into a Catholic document. Now, at the level, if you like, of ecumenism, I think theologically those are massively important points because they really did prove to be a turning point. But in terms of evangelization, we know that there were times historically, and actually in the immediate years coming up to the council, there was some extremely discouraging noises coming out of the Vatican about, you know, the only real Christian unity, the only real ecumenism is that which persuades our separated brethren to return to the one true church. I mean, that was the Catholic idea of ecumenism, more or less, that was prevailing in the 1940s and 50s. But if you look at the document, if you look at the specific document on ecumenism, Unitatis Redintegratio, you will find a very powerful acknowledgement not only of the holiness of the churches, the holiness of the practice, and indeed of the beliefs of churches which are not in union with the Roman Catholic Church, but a very powerful endorsement of the holiness and the practice of the Orthodox churches, particularly in their liturgies, etc., an acknowledgement of the holiness of different forms of religious life. And of course, you know, some of the people who came to the council as observers, Roger Schutz, for instance, you know, the founder of These, there was a real understanding that ecumenism begins, true ecumenism begins with the acknowledgement of the goodwill, the holiness, and the Christ-like presence of all who are followers of Jesus Christ. But it also puts forward that the best form, not only of ecumenical encounter, but of evangelism, is actually for us as Christians to show forth in our life, our prayer, and our works for the poor, the suffering, the life of Christ himself, to be other Christs, as it were, and to demonstrate to the world through our love of the poor, through our service of the sick, through our following of the Christ who knelt down in front of his disciples and washed their feet. It acknowledged not only the power of that in terms of that is the primary evangelization, but it acknowledged the power of such evangelization that was being done by different Christian groups and families all across the world. I want to stop in a moment. I promise I will try and keep to time as best I can. I hope Victoria is keeping a bit of an eye on the time for me. To say that one of the things I did in the 1990s was to go out to Brazil as a missionary. And I was working and studying with some of the great Brazilian liberation theologians, namely Leonardo and Clodovis Boff in particular, and Carlos Mesters, who was the most extraordinary proponent of the Bible I've ever come across, and had an absolutely magical way, just brilliant way of unpacking the Word of God. But it was also the first time that I had come across really hardline evangelicals preaching the prosperity gospel, a prosperity gospel that had been imported from the United States of America, and that had very, very clear and strong political and economic pressures behind it from the United States. And there is a document. I once had a copy of it and somehow lost it in my move from Heathrop College to Cambridge. It was a communique by Ronald Reagan to the FBI about the dangers of liberation theology as a form of stealth Marxism, and how it must be counteracted by good, healthy, evangelical Protestantism that was offered as an alternative to this, you know, dangerous Marxist type Christianity. The prosperity gospel is alive and very, very well in Bolsonaro's Brazil, as I witnessed when I was out there last year. And although, thanks be to God, Bolsonaro is no more on the political scene, I would want to say that I think there is a sense in which populist politics, many of which are putting forward things that are profoundly inimical to the gospel of Jesus Christ are sweeping across not only Europe, but South America and parts of Africa. It seems to me that a very important thing that we can take on board ecumenically is the importance of using that love of the poor, that outreach to the sick and to the disadvantaged, that determination to bring about as far as possible Christ's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven, as we pray every time we pray the Lord's Prayer. It seems to me that that is a litmus test about the authenticity of the gospel we are preaching. Clearly, there are still numerous areas, both of convergence and of disagreement. Probably the best area of convergence was the 1982 so-called Lima document on baptism, Eucharist, and ministry, where I think at all sorts of levels, both the free churches, the Reformed churches of various sorts, and the Catholic and Anglican churches really made headway in being able to accept the integrity of one another's sacramental signs, insofar as our doctrinal definitions allowed. It was an enormous step forward and an enormous gesture of goodwill. But it seems to me that there is also a real red flag waving loud and clear in parts of the world where religious violence is being done in the name of different types of Christianity, and in particular in a form of Christianity that has within it all sorts of socio-political assumptions, which it seems to me are profoundly contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ. So as a Catholic, I would want, first of all, to warmly and enthusiastically celebrate over 100 years now of actually moving towards each other in faith, hope, and love, and respectful appreciation of what we do all add, as it were, to the body of Christ and contribute to the body of Christ. But I would also want to wave at least a flag of warning, if not a flag of danger, as to what ends the gospel is being put to in different parts of the world for purposes which, it seems to me, are very far from the purposes for which Christ himself preached it in the first place. Thank you very much.
Gemma Simmonds. Oh, yeah.
Gemma, thank you. Sorry, I was frantically scribbling notes to contain all that wisdom. That was excellent. That was really, really, really interesting. And a really, I think, unexpected angle to answer the question, but such an important one. And the global focus, bringing liberation theology, with Vatican II. That was fascinating. That was really fascinating. Thank you. Great. So contain your thoughts, everybody. Maybe you can write your questions on a piece of paper so you don't forget them. I'm sure you won't forget them. And we're going to move to the wonderful Reverend Dr. Benjamin Aldous. Ben is a Principal Officer for Mission and Evangelism at Churches Together in England, the National Ecumenical Instrument. Ben himself is particularly interested in mission, ecumenism, and intercultural theology. He spent 16 years in Cambodia and South Africa, firstly as a church planter and then as a parish priest. He completed his doctoral work at the University of Stellenbosch on fresh expressions of church in South Africa in 2008. Ben helps host and curate conversations amongst denominational church leaders with a portfolio of mission from across CTE's 52 member churches. He is the author of the brilliant The God Who Walks Slowly, published by SCM Press in 2022, and with a fabulous co-editor, Lived Mission in 21st Century Britain, which will be published in 2004, now that I've finally got in the bibliography. Ben is also a research fellow at the Queen's Foundation in Birmingham, and he's married to the lovely Sharon, and they have 4 children who live together by the sea in Devon. So Ben, thank you. Please join our conversation.
Thank you, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here with you all. I'm going to share my screen just because I've got some little pictures to help us work through some of what I want to say this evening. So hopefully you can all see these. Can everyone see that? Yeah? Great.
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, good evening, and a big thank you to Gemma for sort of setting the scene. And it's great to be with you all in the week of prayer for Christian unity. So it feels like a very appropriate occasion to think about some of these things. I hope to add and reflect on what evangelism and ecumenism look like on the ground in English settings. And before that, I want to share some terms I'm using quickly. Some of us find the word evangelism difficult, perhaps a fear of evangelism, that a word so tainted with coercive power and colonial subjection that it's no longer of any use and we must be consigned to the rubbish bin of history. Others see the term as perfectly acceptable and as the central task of the church, and may wonder why, from their perspective, we have reneged on proclaiming the gospel. On the surface, these two positions can appear to be mutually exclusive or on opposite ends of a continuum. But I think if we dig a little deeper, we may see that they can mutually feed and encourage one another. The Evangelion most simply is translated as the good news, the coming of God's kingdom. And its source is God alone, and it is pure gift. Of course, sharing this good news has been the central task of the church for 2 millennia, but how it's been done has looked different at different points in history. Our focus on evangelism this evening means wondering how ecumenism in the context of evangelism helped people to Christ. And in this, we must admit that there is no one way in which people encounter the risen Jesus. For some, it's an acute moment of existential reorientation, and for others, the almost imperceptible awakening or discovery of knowing and being known by Christ Jesus. For some, sharing the gospel is a one-way flow, not a transactional operation as such, but definitely the idea that one is the herald and the other is the receiver of the news. We come with the gospel, sharing it with those who have little knowledge or no understanding of God. It's essentially monological. And I want to suggest that there might be a more generous understanding. The notion of bringing people to Christ is an interesting concept because, of course, for many of us, Christ is not just found in our words, but in our acts of loving service and in our community of mutual love. And therefore, we meet Christ in others. There is then a mutuality and a very real possibility of ourselves being evangelized by an encounter with another. Sharing the good news must not be detached in all this from solidarity and justice and the peace of Christ, which I think Gemma was really expounding in her talk. The 1982 affirmation on evangelism and mission from the World Council of Churches says, "There is no evangelism without solidarity. There is no Christian solidarity that does not involve sharing the knowledge of the kingdom, which is God's promise to the poor of the earth." There is here a double credibility test, a proclamation that does not hold forth the promises of the justice of the kingdom to the poor of the earth is a caricature of the gospel, but the Christian participation in the struggles for justice, which does not point toward the promises of the kingdom, also makes a caricature of the Christian understanding of justice. One of my favorite missiologists, Kirsten Kim, says, if God's life is justice, then evangelism is not only telling the gospel story, it is also acting to bring about the good news. It is speaking the truth in love. If God's life is peace, then evangelism cannot be aggressive or violent. We come in peace. Like our Saviour, we say, "Peace be with you." In 21st century Britain, an increasingly secularized context, I think that we will need to be increasingly creative when we share the good news, so it is genuinely offered as good news, and it is done in the name of peace. With all that in mind, I want to share 3 stories, which I hope will kind of ground or concretize some of the things that I'm speaking about. 3 stories from CTE's Good News Stories that we capture over the past couple of years and share on our website. The first comes from the town of Bury in Greater Manchester, where the Churches Together chaplains working at Millgate Shopping Centre. Tristan Sherwin, who is the pastor at Metro Christian Centre, an independent Pentecostal church, and the Reverend Dan Harris, a local United Reform minister, have been acting as chaplains for the shopping centre for close to 18 months, seeking to be an ear for those who work there. On All Hallows Eve last year, they did a beautiful and creative thing. They invited shoppers to take off their masks. Tristan says, looking at the picture above may appear to be nothing more than ribbons of different colours tied to a simple metal lattice work, yet each one represents a person, and in many cases a number of people who were loved but no longer with us. Over the past 6 hours, Dan Harris and I, says Tristan, have been standing in one of the malls at Millgate Shopping Centre in Bury, offering people the opportunity to tie a ribbon as a simple but poignant act of remembrance. To be honest, Dan and I were not all that certain how this invitation would be received. But nevertheless, as the day has gone on, it's been clear that this small act has been, for a good number of people, a breathing space in a world of masks, providing an opportunity to recall and retell something about those they have lost. As we listened, we heard multiple heartbreaking stories as people of various ages have opened up about grief that they carry due to the death of loved ones. We heard stories of cancer, miscarriage, fatal accidents, murder, tragedies that have been indiscriminately deluged lives, leaving a flotsam of emotions and circumstances in the wake. Some losses were as recent as last week, others have left a hole for a number of decades. It's been a humbling day. This, I guess, on one level, isn't a typical example of missional ecumenism, but profoundly, a deeply profound one. It involved being heard and being seen, being real, being vulnerable, and in a sense it was pre-evangelistic. It was cracking open people's hearts to grace. More typical examples might be seen in places where churches work to run an evangelistic course like Christianity Explored, or a number of members of Transforming Teesside who've helped people come to a living faith by co-running Alpha. The 2019 report Doing Mission Together from the Council of Christian Unity revealed how churches were working together in market towns and large villages to share the gospel. Paul Goodlift, the former General Secretary of CTE, commented on the report saying, "What's much more surprising is the degree to which the first mark of mission, proclaiming the good news and engaging in evangelism, is similarly approached ecumenically. Here one might expect differences in theology to play much more a significant role. But the encouraging thing is that old barriers to proclamation together, largely rooted in suspicion of each other, has largely been systematically dismantled." If we take seriously that relationship between evangelism and justice, which I mentioned at the beginning, then I think there are other ways that church can advocate for justice as it uses its resources for the poor or for the marginalized. Take, for example, this group in Lowestoft. A team from Churches Together in Lowestoft have been working for 7 years, setting up a festival chaplaincy. It was ecumenical from the start, and central to what they do is to curate safe spaces where people can come for well-being and spiritual support, all grounded in the Christian ethos. To do this, they offered hand massages, prayer, blessings, free gifts, prayer paintings, and using the Jesus deck readings through pop-up chaplaincies, either in cafes or in the town centre. The festival chaplaincy grew out of a regular street-based chaplaincy, which has Baptist, Anglican, and New Frontiers members. Lowestoft is the most easterly town in the country and therefore the first to see the sunrise at midsummer. The first light festival celebrates summer solstice on the beach, and they were there to set up a soul space connecting with spiritual seekers. This year, the team were also invited to be festival pastors at the Latitude Festival in Suffolk, where they worked with front of house space, engaging with families and young people. Or there's a church is together group in Keswick who've been working hard to finding ways to providing affordable housing using church land. Keswick Community Housing Trust is a land trust that was established as a response to a number of consultations with Churches Together in Keswick in 2010. The aim is to provide homes for local people who cannot afford to buy or rent accommodation at current market rates. They have 40 houses across 4 developments. The biblical idea of shalom is that everyone has a place to call home. When we are present to people, being with them, participating in a sense in the incarnation, something beautiful happens. And by working together across our denominational divides, we reveal new dimensions of the gospel story. We say, in a sense, the gospel story is bigger than we can proclaim or witness alone. And I believe that when we act with generosity towards others' understandings and embodiments of evangelism, we reveal the generosity of our God. Could we, for example, accompany someone on a pilgrimage towards God and say, I've heard you over these weeks and months, I've been with you, perhaps you could explore the Orthodox Church. Or I think you may find a home in the Vineyard Church. What if we had a generosity in our ecumenical evangelism? Well, I hope those stories and those practical examples that I have witnessed in the English context over the last couple of years, something that will be helpful for you to think about, some things for you to chew over. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. That was really, really super. One thing you said has really stuck with me, this idea of cracking open people's hearts to grace. That's really beautiful. Yeah, that's going to stick with me, I think. Thank you. So again, hold your questions. We have our last speaker who's just arrived. Hi, John. Thank you for joining us. I'm excited to see you. So John, let me introduce you. John is a doctoral student and former teaching assistant at Durham University, working with Professors Paul Murray and Karen Kilby. His research is based on exploring what a more pneumatological and charismatically integrated Catholic ecclesiology might look like. He currently serves on a number of ecumenical bodies, particularly related to Eastern and Pentecostal/charismatic churches, and has papers already published in Theological Studies, Irish Theological Quarterly, and also Ecclesiology. So welcome, John, and we're excited for you to join the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Great, wonderful. I was sad, as I'm sure many of you were, that Dr. Coman couldn't join us. I think he's a great theologian, but I was very happy to be able to step in. This is a topic that's been close to my heart for a while. As was mentioned, I'm currently doing a PhD, and my PhD has a strong sort of ecumenical thrust motivating it. And for the first 3 years when I was doing my PhD, I'm doing it part-time. I was also working in a parish, a Catholic parish, as a coordinator for evangelization. So the two the two personally came together very closely for me. And I often saw links, I often saw connections, and so it's a topic I've been thinking about for a long time. But one of the reasons I think particularly that this is such an interesting topic to explore is because the roots of the link are very deep, I think. I mean, you know, the event usually seen as the founding of the modern ecumenical movement is the 1910 World Missionary Conference hosted in Edinburgh. It was during that conference that people who had come around the world, through speaking together, through sharing their experiences of evangelism, realized that Christian division was perhaps the serious obstacle stopping authentic proclamation of the gospel. As John R. Mott noted at the conference's concluding address, open quote, What shall be the issue of these memorable days? Has it not widened us all? Has it not deepened us all? Has it not humbled us increasingly as we discovered that the greatest hindrance to the expansion of Christianity lies in ourselves? Has it not tried us as though by fire, gathered together from different nations and races and communities? Have we not come to realize our oneness in Christ? Close quote. And some decades later, we were a bit slower, us Catholics, we came to the same realization, or one like it, that a key motivator behind the fact that, for example, France, parts of it were becoming what was called a mission territory, was because of Christian disunity in some sense. And Pope John the 23rd, in calling the Second Vatican Council, and he deeply wanted the Second Vatican Council to have an ecumenical thrust to it, is clearly related to his wider underlying motivation that he expressed shortly before the opening of that council, where he said, the purpose of the council is evangelization. It seems that there was this recognition across churches at this time that, sure, there are factors outside of our control which prevents the gospel from being presented in a convincing manner. But the one thing we can change is ourselves. And the key element about ourselves that needs to be changed, it seemed to be realized, was our division. The two, of course, are also linked in scripture. Jesus' high priestly prayer in John 17, which in many ways is a key text of ecumenism, reads as follows, open quote. I ask not only on behalf of these, his disciples, but also on behalf of those who believe in me through their word, that they may be one. As you, Father, are in me and I are in you, may they also be in us, that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory you have given me, I have given them, so that they may be one as we are one. I in them and you in me, that they may be completely one, so that the world may know that you have sent me and have loved them, even as you have loved me. Close quote. May they be one, that the world may believe that you have sent me. If evangelization or evangelism is to aid with the gathering together of the human race, this reunification of humanity, this eschatological anticipation of the unity to come, then how can someone not be profoundly challenged by the divisions within Christianity? It cuts right to the heart of what the church is called to be. It is in itself a counter-witness. Perhaps we could even say an antichrist. And this is so obviously true. We've probably all got experiences relating to this. I remember one experience that personally deeply affected me many years ago. I was reading news articles. This was back when the new atheists were in vogue. And I remember reading some article being very critical about a Christian figure. And I scrolled down, God help me, to read the comments. And she's never advised on articles like that. And I scrolled down to read the comments, and the amount of vitriol, right, the attacks, the brutality, the bigotry that was being expressed, not necessarily to this person who may well have, legitimately had issues with them, but with their whole church. Oh, of course they'd be like that. And I don't know why, but for some reason I decided to click on one of the names of the people who had posted the comment. And I clicked on it, and the other comments came up, that they'd made. And it became clear as I was reading this, but to my great surprise, this person was not an atheist, but another Christian. And I went back and I clicked on some of the others. And not all of them, but a surprising number of them were other Christians, who, because this person was part of a different church, a church that they didn't like, let's pile on. And from that moment, I can't help but wonder how many non-Christians have picked up a negative view of Christianity precisely as a result of hearing Christians speak in that way. So to answer the question, ecumenism and evangelism, conflict or complementarity, the answer to me should seem obvious. They're not just complementary, they're absolutely indispensable. They're co-essential to one another. There we go, done. I can finish. But unfortunately, it's not that simple, is it? But despite the obvious convergence, the reality is that the two do not always go together, that Christians motivated by one are often not as motivated by the other. And indeed, many of those churches which are quickly growing are quite suspicious of ecumenism. Earlier, it was mentioned the 1982 World Council of Churches document, Mission and Evangelization. Following its release, during the Sixth Assembly of the World Council of Churches, an open letter was released by some evangelicals. And while it praised the document, to quote, "No ecumenical document has been so welcomed by evangelicals," close quote, it was highly critical of much of what had been discussed at the assembly itself. Another quote from this open letter: "On occasion, terminology became fuzzy and theology worse." When I was preparing my notes for this, I just Googled evangelization or evangelism and ecumenism. And it was amazing what some of the results that came up. It was types of Christianity. Evangelistic or Christianity and ecumenical Christianity, as if this was two types of Christianity. It was very surprising. And this is not me as a ecumenically minded Christian trying to have a go at evangelicals, by the way. I'm questioning, how did we get here? How did we reach a profoundly ironic place, and deeply sad actually, where ecumenism can be a cause of division? Ecumenism can be seen as a cause of division. And within my own church, I have many Catholic friends and acquaintances who just don't really understand ecumenism. They don't understand a desire for Christian unity. Why should we be interested in other Christians rather than just proving them wrong? Sure, they think, it's good to work with other Christians on topics where they agree with us, but not much beyond that. They see ecumenism as basically, the ecumenical movement as basically this thing over there with those people who are interested in being friends with each other. Sort of everyone, in the best sense, gathering together and singing songs together. But at worst, they see it as a sort of internal secularization, where no one really cares what they believe, and what they believe can never lead to any transformation. Sort of like it's being good humanists, something like that. And it's as I speak to them, I try to show them a different perspective of ecumenism, but often they see ecumenism as watering down the faith rather than allowing the faith to be fuller. They see it as an abandonment of truth rather than a deeper discovery of truth in all its richness. They simply can't understand, for example, how the Vatican can speak out against proselytism, because no one has explained to them, and also it's probably fair to say they haven't sought to learn themselves, what this term means in this context and how it should be understood as not a basic repudiation of the Great Commission. This is not an essential criticism of them. I do think they're largely wrong in this point. But surely it's the responsible of us, interested in ecumenism, to better explain things to them. So much of ecumenism is about learning the language of the other people so as to better express what we believe and why we believe it. And it's a sort of meta ecumenical call, I think, to better explain ecumenism to those not interested in it. I don't think we can be caught up with prophetic zeal to such a degree that we move beyond the basics. There are always new people, and always people whose temperaments are not instinctively ecumenical. There is, however, as I draw to a close, a rather fitting sign of hope I wanted to draw attention to. Somewhat fascinatingly, all the young Catholics I know who are interested in ecumenism have become interested because of a positive experience of one of the other churches, often in some way related to evangelization. It may be, for example, that they're Catholics involved in the charismatic movement who have had a positive experience of Pentecostals, or more commonly related to evangelization programs pioneered in other churches and currently growing in popularity. And it sort of makes sense, I think, this. For if one has had a positive experience of faith on, say, to pick one example, the Alpha course, then instinctively one will have greater openness to Anglicanism. It gives an initial openness to the other churches. Oh, there's something that I gained from them. It's like the initial pastoral conversion. So rather than it just being unity that helps evangelization, it seems to me, from what I can see on the ground, that there can be a wonderful reversal, which evidences their mutual dependency on one another. And the fact that today it seems that the lack of unity around ecumenism is being overcome through evangelization. Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium, one of those documents that did receive a notable ecumenical reception, noted, open quote, "How many important things unite us. If we really believe in the abundantly free working of the Holy Spirit, we can learn so much from one another. It is not just about being better informed about others, but rather about reaping what the Spirit has sown in them, which also means to be a gift to us," close quote. I believe the challenge for us ecumenically minded Christians is to make ecumenism understood to those more evangelistically minded Christians who are suspicious of it, to take the time to make friends with them, to have the humility to receive from them, but to share what we've received also. This sharing of gifts, the gifts that the Spirit has given, those diverse gifts that call to mind 1 Corinthians 12, those metaphorical hands and feet, and so allowing the different parts of the body to come together. Otherwise, as Paul rhetorically asks, where would the body be? And allowing the body of Christ to be seen more fully, it seems to me, is a pretty good way of describing the joint aims of any true evangelism and true ecumenism. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was really, really interesting take on the question. Especially your endpoint, that was quite a curveball. That was really nice. Thank you very much. And I really enjoyed the energy you brought. Great. We'll have a short kind of panel now. So I've jotted down a few questions, and I'd like the panelists to each kind of draw out something from another presentation that they listened to that they enjoyed, that they thought was inspiring, or perhaps it challenged them. But if I'm going to start, I thought I'd just start with an easy question. Just thinking about political, so being political, I think, came up in kind of all of your presentations. I think like there is no absence, but I think a lot of how evangelism is caricatured, especially that comes from the United States, is that it's seen as apolitical. That the church is the Bible only. Gemma, your face is where I'm going. So exactly, they present themselves as kind of not having a political agenda, but as Nathan Dever says very well in the University of Edinburgh, like that doesn't actually make sense, because not having a political agenda allows people to not have to interrogate the political agenda that they are holding. We all have political agendas, and it's the opportunity of the church to kind of to foster that and to help us all stay accountable to it. So this idea that evangelism is apolitical, can we understand evangelism as divorced from the political sphere? And if we can't, then how should they be in relationship?
Victoria, if I can just begin with, a very well-known and very well-documented comment by one of my great Brazilian heroes, Dom Helder Câmara, the late Archbishop of Recife, up in the northeast of Brazil, where, really the most dire poverty pervades even to this day. And he famously said, "When I give something to the poor to eat, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have nothing to eat, they call me a communist." And I think a lot of it is about, how do you ask the question? How do you frame the question? And continually giving something to the poor to eat or drink or shelter themselves with, or, whatever you do to the least of my sisters and brothers, you do it to me. But But what happens when you ask why your sisters and brothers need these things in the first place? You know, how is it that they are in a situation where, however hard they work, however hard they try, however amazingly inventive and creative they are, as the people I met in the favelas of Brazil, you know, they will never be able to live a life of, you know, human dignity, because the system is stacked against them. And it does seem to me that the charity of Christ, you know, St. Paul says, doesn't he, that, you know, the love of Christ kind of urges us, moves us onward, forces us, I think, not only to preach the gospel, but in the name of the gospel, to ask some hard questions of the systems that pervade in this world, and indeed the systems that have all too tragically often been legitimized by Christian discourse. So, you know, to use a theological term, I think we have to apply a hermeneutic of suspicion to a lot of what is peddled as Christianity, when so often it's actually a way of sanctifying and legitimizing monstrous self-interest. That's my take on it anyway.
I think that was an excellent answer. Thank you. Do Ben or John want to jump in? Ben, if you're trying to speak, you're muted.
Sorry, old classic mute mistake. I totally agree with Gemma. I do think there are people who see evangelism as apolitical. Let's be honest. I think there are people who don't want to have or admit that there is a political nature to the gospel, and that people would like to kind of do the Alpha Course in a vacuum that doesn't impinge upon the political dimension of all our lives, and the tentacles of politics that creep into every part of the way we think and act. So I think it's important to, whilst I agree with Gemma, I think the reality is there are some people who believe that evangelism is apolitical, and just to put that there and say that's the reality, even if that's not how we perceive true sort of holistic evangelism. I think it's just important to note that.
Absolutely, thank you. It's really helpful. John, do you want to add to this question too?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that is interesting to me when I was reading about the origins of the ecumenical movement is that the divisions that were existing between churches that they recognized at the World Missionary Conference, it wasn't just, oh, this church is coming to this country and this church is coming to this country. It was tensions between churches that already existed in the countries and churches coming from outside. And depending on how widely you define politics, I think that's clearly political tensions there, or certainly tensions that relate to politics. On one just comment I'd like to make more widely, though, I sometimes feel that there can be a temptation for ecumenical gatherings to be, it's not this, but people who mostly are temperamentally already predisposed to liking one another. And it may not be that they agree necessarily doctrinally with everything, but they maybe are more closely politically aligned, which provides a help, right? And that's a helpful thing in order to get to know one another better. But I think that ecumenism, one of the difficulties of ecumenism is precisely in the difference. And one of the elements that is dividing our society at the moment is increased politicization, politicized polarization. And in that context, I think those of us interested in ecumenism can't just give up on people who are politically of a different opinion to us. it's not okay to say, oh, well, those are the bad Christians or something like that, you know. So actually, we don't do ecumenism with them.
Thank you. I think I always talking. This is my supervisor for Brian Stanley. Talked about Edinburgh 1910, and very much it was a myth. Like it wasn't meant to be an ecumenical conference that I always find fascinating. So you know, we pinpoint it as the start of the ecumenical movement, but it was a missionary conference that, on purpose, because of the Anglo-Catholic influence, and not wanting to upset the Catholics who had missions in Latin America, it stopped having that agenda. So I find it fascinating to continue to remind myself that ecumenism came from mission, and mission kind of was pushed onto this country from the mission field, and kind of that reversal of relationships I find useful to keep kind of reintroducing. Another question, I think this stemmed from your presentation, I think, John, when you're talking about kind of how unkind we can be to each other as Christians. And I've just been reading about you know, Scotland in the 1930s under John White, and the sectarianism of the General Assembly and the Presbyterian kind of idea, and like realizing actually that really wasn't very far away at all. That there was this absolute racism towards Irish people and Roman Catholics, and there were quotas about, you know, that Scotland's going to be taken over by Roman Catholics, and there's actually, you know, ridiculous kind of political rhetoric, but that a lot of this is still around. But I think maybe we've moved away a little bit from resentment towards other denominations, and it's more kind of resentment towards other theological positions. And I think this has changed because it's also internal. So even within denominations, so I'm teaching in a Church of England TEI, I'm URC, but we have similar things. We see ourselves as a middle of the road college, but that means we have so many conversations about, you know, who's really represented and who's not, and what's happening at General Synod. And when we go to the other TEIs who have more of an identity, gosh, all hell breaks loose. So I think I'm really interested in that kind of the shift that we've had between anti-denominations towards a more like anti-position, and what that means for us working towards evangelism, maybe through an ecumenical lens, when we can have so much suspicion of someone because of their theological holdings that's not necessarily related to their denomination. Does that make sense as a question? I think that was a question. There was a question in there somewhere.
Possibly.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in identifying that there's been this shift, right?
John, could you get nearer the microphone,
sure,
please?
sorry. Sorry, is that better?
Yeah, hugely.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
I'll hold my hand here permanently if I can. I think there's definitely been a shift, right? The denominational lines don't feel as sharp as many other, yeah, as you said, sort of positional issues are sharpening lines. On the topic of the sort of vitriol and churches fighting each other, I was very struck once. I was reading a book by the sociologist of religion, Steve Bruce, and he tracked, or his belief was that the origins of secularization were in the Reformation. Now that's not me as a Catholic saying there's a problem with it's all Reformation's fault. It wasn't about the Reformation itself, or even any particular issue taken up by the Reformation. It was the wars of religion that followed the Reformation, and then the sort of secularized peace that had to be enforced following it. But because of the vitriol and the hatred, the rulers had to basically impose a sort of okay, well, neither of you, just both of you be quiet position. And that in turn, he thinks, led to the origins of eventually modern secularization. And so, right, you know, the problem for us in countries that had Christian roots of unbelief is intrinsically tied up with this question, at least if he's right, and not everyone thinks he is, but it's worth thinking about and researching more, I think.
Can I say something just about my work at CTE, which I think in some ways is partially an antidote to that kind of positionality and vitriol, is when you take people together over a period of time, who meet regularly on a regular basis and begin to form deep, significant friendships with one another. I mean, there's all sorts of types of ecumenism. There's the structural ecumenism, there's a kind of social ecumenism. There's, I think, the spiritual ecumenism that is rooted in friendships, which can, I think, flourish even between people who hold very different theological positions. And I don't believe that as a kind of theory. I've seen the reality of that over the last 5 years in my role, particularly the group for evangelization. So in a couple of weeks' time, I'm taking 25 denominational leaders, mostly with the portfolio for mission and evangelism, to spend the day at the Coptic Orthodox Church in East London and to celebrate the feast of St. Jonah. Now, there'll be evangelicals who know absolutely nothing about orthodoxy or about the Coptic Orthodox Church or what the feast of St. Jonah is, but they're coming together to be part of the service, and after the service to eat with brothers and sisters from Egypt and Sudan, mostly a refugee church, quite a young church. And then after that, they will spend the rest of the afternoon together sharing what they've experienced, sharing what's happening in their own denominations. There are friendships that have grown there between people who actually on Twitter would theoretically be, having a bust up. But that doesn't happen because they've learnt to see each other and to genuinely care for one another, even though they hold very different theological positions. And their churches sometimes are moving in very different directions, theologically, politically. So I think that there's cause for hope that we can learn to see each other across the divides and genuinely build strong relationships.
If I could add just briefly to that, it just interests me. I try to avoid it, but every once in a while I look into the Catholic blogosphere, and it's like swimming in a septic tank. It's just vile, just horrendous. And it seems to me that actually the people who go in for this, kind of hate invective, it's actually got very little to do with beliefs as such, and a great deal to do with psychology. And it's been of immense interest to me. I work in some ways quite closely with Archbishop Justin Welby, because I'm chair of trustees of the Ecumenical Community of St. Anselm, which is based in Lambeth Palace. And I know that he has had an extremely tough time at the hands of various very indignant Christians of very different kind of denominational positions over the question of the blessing of same-sex relationships. And if you saw the level of vilification and just hatred that is currently being aimed at Pope Francis for exactly the same reason from within the ranks of the Catholic bishops and clergy, let alone anybody else. And, what we've got is people who are maintaining very, very different theologies and theological positions from right across the spectrum of Christian belief, but are using the same methodology, to vilify a person who is holding, particularly somebody in a position of authority, who is trying to kind of make moves. And it seems to me that is more about psychology than it is about actual theological positions, because they hold very different theological positions, but still appear to think it's perfectly all right, as long as they hide behind the anonymity of the internet, to say things which Well, I would love to place them in front of Jesus Christ himself and say, go on, say that again, my friend, in Christ. Because they couldn't possibly, you know. And there, I think we're dealing with, well, it's an age-old phenomenon, but I think it's been very much facilitated by the anonymity of the internet, where, you know, at the end of the day, believing in the gospel and proclaiming the gospel is one thing. Doing the gospel and living the gospel and integrating the gospel into the way you deal, particularly with your perceived enemies, that's a very different kettle of fish, huh? 2007 was the first year in which the Catholic Church sent participants rather than observers to a Congress of the World Council of Churches. And I was a member of the Catholic delegation at that time. We went off to Athens. And I remember the first big morning when the Archbishop of Athens, the Orthodox Archbishop of Athens, was welcoming us, you know, to his country and everything else. And we had police choppers and we had army bomb disposal experts and sniffer dogs all around the hall where we were gathered. And I remember saying to one of them, gosh, you know, has there been a threat? You know, who's doing this? Is it some kind of, you know, atheistic or whoever group? And they said, no, it's the Orthodox, you know, it's the fundamentalist Orthodox who have threatened to bomb this entire assembly and to kill their own archbishop because he's talking to heretics. It's a mindset. You know, it's a mindset rather than a theological position, it seems to me.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's important that we recognise, as Ben did really well, I think, the guilt around kind of the weird evangelism and how obviously colonialism and that resonance of empire is related to that. But I also think the more recent Me Too movement and all the scandals of clergy and like most of our denominations or all of our denominations have also brought about this suspicion of the church. And I'm noticing, or there are probably two main ways people circumvent that. One way is that we kind of demonize other churches and we say, oh, but our church isn't like that. They're the bad churches, we're the good one. I also find another one might be to say, well, evangelism comes from God, so it's got nothing to do with the institution, it's got nothing to do with me, but this is God doing the work. And I also find that can also be a little bit of a get out of jail free card. So I'm not sure how we can kind of overcome that guilt that comes with the word evangelism. But I think, as Ben said, this idea about grace, maybe thinking humility is useful. Leading on from that, because I've run out of time and I have so many things to say. I think thinking about evangelism as apologetics is quite useful in this post-secular world, like this idea that we can just be relevant as the church and people will understand our theological positions, I think is false. So I think any kind of public theology is apologetics, but I question whether public theology is evangelism, because does that allow people to come into faith on their own? If we're going to the Brazilian liberation theologians, does that allow for conscientization? Does this allow people to build up? So thinking about tools and power in this discussion, I think, is quite important, and I think all of us have touched on that a little bit. Thank you, George. It's been lovely to hear from you. So if anyone wants to kind of touch on any of the two things I've just blabbered out there, go for it. If not, we can open up the floor for questions. So whilst people are thinking of a question, if any of the speakers want to jump in, you're more than welcome to.
I think John has a hand up.
Callan's got a hand up.
Grant, please, Callan.
My question, I think, follows on from what you've been saying. Links in also some of the stuff that Gemma was saying about the prosperity gospel. So one of the things that is appealing about the prosperity gospel is you can see theoretically at least, what the gospel might do. And I think that probably one of the greatest things we need to give witness to the gospel is to show forth the power of the gospel. And I think that probably means in terms of deeper justice and transformation of life. And so the whole question of holiness. But my question is really, which I'd like you to comment upon if possible, is about the role of unity in that. Because it seems to me that if unity is, as Jesus describes it in his famous prayer in John 17, about sharing in the life of God together, then it has to be transformative of individuals. And so at root, it's about holiness. It has to be transformative of relationships. And so it's about a quality of life, a genuine quality of life that other people can participate in. And it also has to be transformative of the structures. And so necessarily has a political dimension. So my thought would be that actually unity lived properly comes first in order to and alongside in order to do evangelism or evangelization, not first in the sense of you do unity first and then go and do the evangelization, but first in the sense of the quality that needs to be there in order to allow the evangelization, which we need to do anyway, so it can be effective.
Mm.
I don't know what comments you'd like to make on that.
This takes me beyond ecumenism into faith dialogue, but my niece, who is a hugely kind of practical person, the night of the Grenfell disaster, just having seen it all on the television, thought, I can't just sit here, and went down to Grenfell. And you can imagine it was absolute chaos. There was sort of mess everywhere. But at the same time, there were people turning up with bag loads of goods and things for the people who'd been burnt out of house and home. And what she found was all the churches, all of the faith communities down there, including a whole busload of wonderful Sikh ladies who sort of set up a kitchen in the street and started cooking up a storm of curry and feeding it to anybody who looked as if they needed a good meal, you know? And she said, actually, I learned something that night about the power of faith when it simply says, you know, faith, hope, love demand that we act, that we respond. But we respond out of a kind of deep love of human beings and a sense that this is the way that godliness is performed. And, you know, the churches were all open. The Catholic Church down there had opened its doors, you know, to let people come in and sit and have cups of tea, but also to sleep there for the night if they needed to. And so had various other local churches. And, you know, I just remember her description of it as being a night of really seeing people enacting their deepest held beliefs and values in a way that was performative and convincing, you know, and ultimately, whatever else people may think about, you know, the church, whatever they mean by that, or faith or anything else, when they meet faith, hope, and love in a genuine human embodiment, they know what they're seeing. You know, that is convincing. Possibly not convincing sufficiently to make them join that particular faith, but it's convincing of the power of the momentum behind it, it seems to me. And it's precisely not convincing, however eloquent we may be or clever theologically we may be, if basically we don't put our money where our mouth is. And that seems to me to be the most important ecumenical task of our day. You know, to do that in a way, you know, people are being failed everywhere in the world by our political and economic institutions. And, you know, it's not that we are all offering an alternative politics or an alternative economics, but that we are, it seems to me, offering people a way to become as deeply human in a Christ-like way as it's possible to be. And that seems to me to be the first tier of evangelism, really.
That's a really lovely response, Gemma. Thank you. Ben or John, would you like to respond to Callan, or should we move to another question?
Yeah, I think Gemma has done a sterling job there. Let's potentially move to some other questions because we've only got 13 minutes left.
I saw John Cooper with a hand waving and wondered if, John, you had a question there.
The good news is Callan covered half of it a lot more eloquently. However, I think there is a shift going on which the church doesn't quite know how to make sense of yet, in that the church's geographic power is disappearing. Particularly within the Anglican Church, it's having to accept it can't be the church everywhere all the time for everyone just because its doors are open. And for the rest of us who've been around long enough that we feel like we're still in the same place, we're discovering our missions, etc., are shutting. So looking at that crossover between social witness and evangelism and mission, what I'm always inspired and struck by are those who do a basic analysis of what is our need to be in this place now, ... but also what about my faith leads me to want to reach out to a particular community who is not being reached by good news with good news. And we see that today in things like street pastors and things like that. That's sort of almost what I would call informal ecumenical stuff that doesn't need huge, multi-year extravaganzas to explain the meaning of the word if in a sentence, but says our shared understanding means that we can work together. So I just wonder, from your experiences, how we can listen well with each other about where to do new bits of mission, because it is needed. We need to be out sharing the good news, and our social action gives us tools to transform the world. I love what Ben shared at the beginning. I'll be emailing him for the peace quote. But I think we need both. And I think it could provide the language if we don't view it as a false binary, but one leading to the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I wanted to share some of those practical stories from what's happening on the ground. There are many more. I just chose 3 that are around housing and chaplaincy, 2 chaplaincy examples, but there are multiple others. I think that the kind of ABCD community development tools are really useful. And there's some really good tools from movements like Fresh Expressions about listening to your community and doing that as a community. So not imposing something as, you know, ecumenical Christians on a community, but gathering with the community that you're seeking to serve and saying, what do you need? How can we best serve you? I think there's been a lot of imposition in mission and evangelism in the past. Coming in weakness and humility, saying we don't have all the answers. As Victoria mentioned earlier, I'm a big fan of Kosake Koyama, the Japanese theologian, and he talks very powerfully about what he calls crucified resources. So too often churches come with all their kind of resource power. They come in as the host into a community or want to kind of take the lead and, you know, we know what you need. Whereas Koyama says we should come with these crucified resources. So these are our open wounded hands. He talks about, you know, we come in our woundedness and our weakness, not with all the answers. So I think it's about posture of the community you seek to come and give to a community, and within that, there's an evangelistic thread that runs through that, I think.
to sort of answer the question sort of from the side, something related to it. When I was working as an evangelization coordinator, one of the difficulties with doing any programs of evangelization, programs more in getting involved with the local community, was finding people who could actually give up their time or were willing to give up their time in a repeated ongoing way. And I think for both ecumenism and evangelization, it's like the starting point needs to be, how do we get a team of people who are willing to do this? And actually, interestingly, quite a lot of evangelization programs can help with that. You know, things we ran in our parish, and I invited people to be part of a team. Those who said yes wanted to do more afterwards. People who had been through it wanted to do more afterwards. But it's like this initial, especially, so where I was working in London, there's a very high turnover of people, actually. Like sometimes the issues are, and this is an area which is, you had millionaires in the church, in the local church, and you know, I mean, homeless people slept in the back of the church every day. It was a real demographic shift, and but there was a real demographic shift of people who move in. It was part of London. You'd move in, and then people would move out, or they'd go back to Spain or Italy, and so the turnover of people, it was really difficult, and that's like a problem of no bad will. And I don't really know. I mean, I'm happy to, there's always going to be things like that, isn't there, challenging us. But I really do think that in this, the work, it's like at least in the contexts I've been in, almost before you can get into that question of sort of community engagement, how can you help? There needs to be, how can you better get people who already come to church to sort of connect with, this is something you do as being part of church. Sort of side, not directly answering your question, but there we go.
I'm just going to make quick mention of the comment, which is just thinking about interchurch families as kind of a microcosm of evangelism and unity, and I think that's a really helpful comment. I'm going to go to Alvin just for our last quick question for our last 6 minutes together.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to our speakers. It's been fascinating. In a sense, it's a question which is about accountability. And it was raised in part, but it could be extended to almost any issue. But it was raised by Gemma's reference to the vilification of the Archbishop of Canterbury and Pope Francis. Any such action not only impairs and breaks unity, but also the efficacy of God's mission. And I just wondered if the speakers could reflect on how the church enables accountability within itself.
The devastating question, Alvin, really. One of the things that I peddle in life, I teach it and attempt to practice it, and I'm very much involved with it with regard to the community of St. Anselm, is spirituality in the Ignatian tradition. And St. Ignatius, which is a fantastically ecumenical tool. If I go to the Jesuit retreat centre in St. Byno's these days, I meet certainly more Anglicans and members of the church in Wales and, you know, independent Baptists and things than I do Catholics. But Ignatius very much promotes what he calls the examen, the examination of consciousness, the prayer of awareness, of it being part of our spiritual discipline to really interrogate ourselves on a daily basis as to how is the way that I think, I speak, I react, how is that in any way connecting with the presence of God in my life and in the world? And are there any, is there any evidence that I'm actually missing or withdrawing from you know, the presence of God in daily life? And I think that is the best tool of accountability, not only for individuals, but for communities that there is, because it faces us with, you know, has there, in the way that I am who I am, has there been an increase of faith, of hope, of love in me today, or has there not? And if there has not, then it is a sign that whoever it is we're following, it's not Jesus Christ. That's my final word on things.
Quite a good final word, I think. John, please.
I actually think one of the real needs in ecumenism, and one of the great benefits that we can get from ecumenism, is other churches in love challenging us on topics. I'm all for receptive ecumenism. You know, my supervisor Paul Murray's, it's his baby. I'll be kicked out if I don't say that. But no, I do like it, and I do really value it. But I think that there's what receptive ecumenism is. I see the problem within my church, and I draw with dynamic integrity something from another church into mine, right? But sometimes I don't see what's wrong with me. We have blind spots, and it's a blind spot precisely because we don't see it. We're blind to it. And one of the most useful things about having genuine ecumenical friendships is that when they can say, I think there's an issue here, and you think, oh, I hadn't thought of it like that. So as far as structures of accountability, I don't know, but I think that's something that I would like to see more of in ecumenism, in love, right? Genuine love, not like it's truthful and therefore it's loving. I mean, actually, in genuine love, where people feel they can share issues they might have or sense with something that's happening. That would be my answer.
Would you like to add anything in the final 2 minutes?
Certainly not.
Excellent. Great. Thank you for your 3 speakers. Thank you, Ben, Gemma, and John. I really enjoyed all of your presentations and the discussions. Thank you, everybody who had questions and who had comments. Callum, would you like to say anything on behalf of the Society before we log off?
I think I'll pass on to Alison there because we have our annual general meeting coming up. She's probably the best person to speak about that.
Well, thank you everyone for attending our webinar this evening. We do hope that you have found it stimulating and helpful. The evening has been recorded, and when it becomes available on our website, I will send you an email so that you can re-watch